when desperate widow Margaret Sinclair shocked the entire town by spending her last gold coins to buy a bruised cowboy and his silent toddler at a public auction. She had no idea she was purchasing far more than just ranch hands. But as dangerous enemies from Jake Morrison's past rode into her Wyoming territory seeking deadly revenge, would her bold gamble to save two broken souls end up destroying everything she'd fought to protect? The sound of a crying baby cut through the dusty air like a knife, making everyone in Cedar Flats Town Square turn their heads. Margaret Sinclair pressed her hand against her swollen belly and felt her own unborn child kick in response to the distant wails. She had come to town for supplies, not to watch human beings get sold like cattle, but something about that baby's cry made her feet stop moving. The Wyoming Territory in September of 1881 was no place for the weak, and Margaret had learned that lesson the hard way when fever took her husband 3 months ago. Now she stood alone in a crowd of rough men, her auburn hair tucked under a simple bonnet, watching the most heartbreaking sight she'd ever seen. On the wooden platform where livestock usually got auctioned, a tall cowboy held a small boy against his chest. The man's face showed purple bruises that looked fresh, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder. But it was the way he held that child that made Margaret's throat tight with emotion. His big hands were gentle as he rocked the crying toddler, whispering words too soft for the crowd to hear. "Next up, we got Jake Morrison and his boy," the auctioneer shouted, his voice harsh as sandpaper. "They'll work hard for whoever buys them, and the kid's young enough to train up right." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Men were bidding on a father and child like they were horses or farm tools. She watched Jake's face go blank as he stared out at the crowd, but his arms never stopped protecting his son. "What happened to them?" Margaret whispered to the woman next to her. The woman, who smelled like harsh soap and had mean eyes, snorted with disgust. "Morrison used to work for Bull Garrett's ranch. Got too big for his britches and tried to steal cattle. Garrett caught him and beat him good before turning him out with nothing but the clothes on his back and that squalling brat." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. She knew Bull Garrett by reputation, a cruel man who treated his workers like dirt. But something about this story didn't feel right. The way Jake held his son showed pure love, not the callousness of a thief. "Starting bid is $25 for the pair," the auctioneer called out. A few hands went up lazily. Margaret could see these men calculating how much work they could squeeze out of a desperate father. They saw broken tools, not human beings who deserved dignity and kindness. $30, called out a rancher Margaret recognized as someone who worked his hands until they dropped. $35, shouted another voice. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes fixed on something far away, like he was trying to protect his mind from what was happening to his body. The little boy had stopped crying and now clung to his father's neck with tiny fists. Margaret thought about her own situation. Her husband had left her a small ranch and some money, but winter was coming and she had a baby on the way. She needed help with the cattle and the endless repairs that kept a ranch running. But more than that, she recognized something in Jake's eyes, the same fierce protectiveness she felt for her unborn child. The bidding continued, creeping higher as men calculated the value of cheap labor. Margaret watched Jake's face carefully and saw him swallow hard when the price reached $40. She realized he was probably hoping for someone kind, someone who might treat his son well. $45, came a gruff voice from the back. That's when Margaret saw Bull Garrett himself pushing through the crowd, a cruel smile on his fat face. Her blood turned cold as ice water. Garrett wasn't here to buy. He was here to make sure Jake Morrison got sold to someone who would make his life pure misery. $50, Garrett called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Margaret saw Jake's shoulders slump slightly. Whatever had happened between these two men, Garrett intended to control Jake's fate even now. The little boy seemed to sense the danger and whimpered against his father's neck. Without thinking, Margaret stepped forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she knew she couldn't let this injustice happen in front of her eyes. $100, she called out, her voice ringing clear and strong across the suddenly silent crowd. Every head turned to stare at her, the pregnant widow who had just offered more money than most of these men made in 3 months. Garrett's face twisted with surprise and anger, while Jake's eyes went wide with shock. The auctioneer's mouth fell open for a moment before he recovered. "Did I hear $100 from the lady?" "You heard right," Margaret said, walking closer to the platform. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she kept her gaze fixed on Jake's face. $100 for both of them. "This is highly unusual," the auctioneer muttered, looking around nervously. "Money's money," Margaret replied firmly. "Do I hear any other bids?" The crowd buzzed with whispered conversations, but no other hands went up. Bull Garrett's face had turned red as a tomato, but even he couldn't justify bidding higher for men he claimed were worthless thieves. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer's hammer hung in the air. "Sold to Mrs. Sinclair for $100. Jake Morrison's legs nearly gave out beneath him as the pregnant woman climbed the steps to the auction platform. Up close, he could see that her green eyes held both determination and kindness, a combination he hadn't encountered in so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. His son Tommy peeked over his shoulder at her, his tear-stained face curious despite his fear. "Ma'am," Jake's voice came out rough as gravel. "You sure you know what you're doing? I'm not exactly in prime condition, and the boy—" He gestured helplessly at Tommy, who had buried his face against his father's neck again. Margaret pulled a leather pouch from her coat pocket and counted out gold coins that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that much money in one place. His mind raced with questions about who this woman was and why she would spend a fortune on two strangers. "What's your name, little one?" Margaret asked gently, reaching out slowly toward Tommy. "His name's Tommy," Jake answered when his son remained silent. "He's not talked much since." Jake's throat closed up. He couldn't bring himself to explain about the night they'd fled Garrett's ranch, about the things Tommy had seen that no child should witness. Margaret nodded like she understood without needing details. "Hello, Tommy. I'm Margaret." She smiled at the boy, then looked up at Jake. "And you're Jake Morrison?" "Yes, ma'am." Jake shifted Tommy to his hip, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing ribs. "I want you to know whatever you paid for us, I'll work it off fair and square. I may look beat up, but I know cattle and horses, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "I'm sure you are," Margaret replied, but something in her tone made Jake look at her more carefully. "But first, let's get you both fed and cleaned up. My ranch is about an hour's ride from here." As they walked toward Margaret's wagon, Jake became aware of the whispers following them. A pregnant widow buying men at auction was unusual enough, but the amount she'd paid had set tongues wagging from one end of the territory to the other. He wondered if she understood what kind of talk this would cause. "Mrs. Sinclair," Jake said quietly as she helped Tommy climb into the wagon bed, "folks are going to have opinions about what you did today." Margaret's chin lifted in a way that reminded Jake of his own mother when she was being stubborn. "Let them talk. I've got more important things to worry about than gossip." She climbed onto the wagon seat with some difficulty, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. Jake automatically reached out to steady her elbow, then pulled his hand back quickly. He wasn't sure what the rules were in this strange new situation. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, arranging her skirts. "Would you mind driving? These roads can be rough, and—" She gestured toward her belly. Jake took the reins gratefully, needing something to do with his hands. The horses were well-fed and responsive, telling him something about how Margaret treated the creatures in her care. Behind them, Tommy had curled up against a pile of feed sacks and was already dozing in the warm afternoon sun. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said as they left the town behind. "Of course." "Why?" The question came out blunter than he intended. "You could have hired hands for less money and no questions asked." "Why bias?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "My husband died 3 months ago, left me with a ranch to run and a baby coming in winter." She paused, her hands folding over her belly. "I've learned that sometimes the people society throws away are the ones with the most to offer." Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Bull Garrett tell you what I supposedly did? I heard rumors. Margaret's voice carried no judgment. I also saw how you held your son during that whole awful business. A man who loves his child that much doesn't steal cattle for fun. The simple statement hit Jake harder than any of Garrett's fists had. For months, he'd carried the weight of being branded a thief and a failure. Having someone look at him and see something different felt like stepping into sunlight after living in a cave. I need you to know the truth, Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke him. I did take cattle from Garrett's ranch. 3 head, in the middle of the night. Margaret didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. Tommy's mother died birthing him, Jake continued. I worked for Garrett for 2 years, trying to save enough to buy land somewhere safe to raise my boy. But Garrett kept finding reasons to dock my pay, broken tools, missing supplies, anything he could think of. Then one night, I caught him. Jake's hands tightened on the reins. I caught him talking about selling Tommy to some travelers passing through. Said the boy would fetch good money from folks who needed children to work their claims. Margaret's sharp intake of breath told him she understood exactly what kind of people Garrett had been talking about. I took those 3 cattle as payment for 2 years of stolen wages and got Tommy out of there the same night, Jake finished. Garrett's been hunting us ever since, making sure no decent person would hire me. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the creak of wagon wheels and the distant call of meadowlarks. Finally, Margaret spoke. How old is Tommy? Just turned 3 last month. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Good age for learning. My ranch has plenty of safe spaces for a curious little boy to explore. She looked at Jake directly. And plenty of work for a man who knows cattle. Jake felt tears threaten for the first time since the night they'd fled. Mrs. Sinclair, I don't know how to repay what you did back there. Call me Margaret, she said with a smile that transformed her entire face. And you can start by helping me figure out how to fix the south fence before winter. It's been giving me trouble for weeks. As they topped a small hill, Jake saw the ranch spread out below them, a neat house surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, with cattle grazing in green pastures. It looked like the kind of place he'd dreamed of providing for Tommy, the kind of home that seemed impossible for people like them. Welcome home, Margaret said softly. But even as hope bloomed in Jake's chest, a dust cloud on the horizon reminded him that Bull Garrett was not the kind of man to forget a grudge. Their troubles were far from over. The rooster's crow cut through the morning darkness like a gunshot, jolting Jake awake in the small loft room above Margaret's kitchen. For a split second, panic gripped his chest as he forgot where he was. Then he saw Tommy sleeping peacefully beside him, clutching a carved wooden horse Margaret had found in her late husband's things. The sight of his son's relaxed face, free from the worry lines that had marked it for months, made Jake's throat tight with gratitude. Downstairs, he could already hear Margaret moving around the kitchen, the soft clatter of pans and the whistle of the kettle creating a melody of home he'd almost forgotten existed. The smell of bacon drifted up through the floorboards, making his stomach growl with hunger, real hunger, not the desperate gnawing he'd grown used to. Morning, Margaret called softly as Jake descended the narrow stairs, careful not to wake Tommy. She stood at the stove with one hand supporting her lower back, her auburn hair braided simply down her spine. Even in the dim lamplight, Jake could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. You shouldn't be up this early, Jake said, moving automatically to pour himself coffee from the blue pot on the table. Especially not cooking for us. Margaret turned with a smile that chased away the last shadows of his bad dreams. Cattle don't care if I'm tired, and neither does this little one. She patted her rounded belly with gentle affection. Besides, I like having people to cook for again. Gets lonely, talking only to cows and chickens. Jake sipped the coffee, real coffee, not the bitter chicory water he'd been drinking for months, and studied Margaret's face in the lamplight. Dark circles under her eyes told him she wasn't sleeping well, and he wondered if the baby was keeping her awake or if worry was stealing her rest. Tell me about the ranch, Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. What needs doing first? Relief flickered across Margaret's features, and Jake realized she'd been carrying the weight of the ranch's problems alone for too long. The south fence is my biggest worry. Posts are rotting, and the wires come loose in 3 places. I've been moving the cattle away from that section, but it's my best grazing land. Jake nodded, his mind already working on solutions. What about materials? You got replacement posts? Some. My husband cut a pile before he... Margaret's voice caught slightly. Before he got sick. They're seasoned and ready. Just need someone with the strength to set them proper. I can handle that. Jake felt the first stirring of purpose he'd experienced in months. What else? Margaret pulled a worn notebook from her apron pocket and flipped through pages covered with neat handwriting. The barn doors hanging crooked been that way since the last big wind. And the windmills making a grinding noise that worries me. Plus, I need to separate the bull calves before they get too frisky with the heifers. The list painted a picture of a woman drowning in responsibilities no one person should handle alone, especially not while carrying a child. Jake felt anger stir in his chest, not at Margaret, but at a world that left pregnant widows to fend for themselves. We'll tackle the fence first, Jake decided. If cattle get loose, everything else becomes 10 times harder. Footsteps on the stairs announced Tommy's arrival, his hair sticking up like wheat stubble and the wooden horse still clutched in his small fist. The boy had grown braver over the past week, no longer hiding behind Jake's legs when Margaret spoke to him. "Morning, Tommy," Margaret said warmly, cracking eggs into the skillet. "Did you sleep well?" Tommy nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by speaking. Horse slept good too. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since they'd arrived, and Jake felt his eyes burn with sudden tears. Margaret's face lit up like sunrise, but she was smart enough not to make a big fuss that might scare Tommy back into silence. "I'm glad to hear it," she said simply, placing a plate of eggs and bacon in front of the boy. Horses need good sleep to stay strong. As they ate breakfast in comfortable quiet, Jake found himself studying the kitchen with new eyes. Everything showed Margaret's careful touch: clean curtains at the windows, herbs drying in neat bundles, dishes arranged with military precision on open shelves. But he also noticed things that worried him. The way she favored her left side when she moved, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, the careful way she lowered herself into chairs. "Margaret," Jake said carefully, "when's the baby due?" "December, near as I can figure." She avoided his eyes, focusing instead on cutting Tommy's bacon into small pieces. "Doc Chun from town says everything looks normal." But Jake had grown up on a ranch where animals birthed young, and he'd learned to read the signs of trouble. Something in Margaret's posture told him she was having a harder time than she wanted to admit. "Maybe we should have the doc come out for another visit," Jake suggested. "Make sure everything's going smooth." Margaret's hands stilled on Tommy's plate. "Doctors cost money I don't have to spare." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Jake understood pride, had lived on it for months when it was all he had left. But he also understood that pride could kill you if you weren't careful. "What if I trade some work for the doc's visit?" Jake offered. "I heard he's been looking for someone to repair his barn roof." Margaret looked up sharply. "You'd do that?" "Course I would." Jake kept his voice matter-of-fact, not wanting to embarrass her with too much sentiment. "We're partners now, aren't we? Partners look out for each other." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, surprise giving way to gratitude, then to something warmer that made Jake's chest tight. "Partners," she repeated softly, like she was testing the word. Tommy, who had been listening with the intense focus children brought to adult conversations they didn't quite understand, suddenly looked up from his breakfast. "Papa and Mama are partners?" The innocent question hung in the air like smoke. Jake felt heat climb his neck as he realized how their arrangement might look to a 3-year-old who desperately wanted the security of a complete family. Margaret's cheeks flushed pink, but her voice stayed steady. "We're friends who help each other, Tommy, like how you help me gather eggs from the chickens." Tommy considered this explanation with the seriousness of a judge, then nodded and returned to his breakfast. But Jake caught the flicker of disappointment in the boy's eyes and felt his heart clench with guilt. Was he giving Tommy false hope by staying here? Was he being selfish, putting his own need for safety ahead of his son's emotional well-being? "I should get started on that fence," Jake said abruptly, standing and carrying his empty plate to the wash basin. "Jake!" Margaret's voice stopped him at the door. When he turned, her green eyes held understanding that cut straight through his defenses. "Tommy's safe here. We all are." But as Jake headed toward the barn to gather tools, he couldn't shake the feeling that their safety was more fragile than Margaret realized. Somewhere out there, Bull Garrett was still angry, still dangerous, and still capable of destroying everything they were trying to build. The sound of approaching hoofbeats in the distance made Jake's blood run cold. It was too early for neighbors, too deliberate for casual travelers. As he reached for the rifle Margaret kept by the barn door, Jake wondered if their borrowed peace was already coming to an end. The rider approaching through the morning mist looked like death itself, his black coat flapping behind him like broken wings as his horse pounded across the prairie toward Margaret's ranch. Jake's finger tightened on the rifle trigger until he made out the distinctive medical bag bouncing against the man's saddle. Dr. Samuel Chun, riding hard enough to kill his horse. "Margaret!" Jake shouted toward the house, his voice carrying an urgency that brought her to the door immediately, Tommy clinging to her skirts. "Doc's coming fast." Dr. Chun pulled his lathered horse to a sliding stop in the yard, his usually calm face tight with worry. "Mrs. Sinclair, thank God you're safe. I bring news from town. Bull Garrett escaped from the county jail last night." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known this moment would come, had felt it creeping closer like a storm on the horizon, but hearing it spoken aloud made his knees weak with terror. "How?" Margaret's voice stayed steady, but Jake saw her hand move protectively to her belly. Dr. Chun dismounted quickly, his movements sharp with nervous energy. "Sheriff Morrison claims Garrett overpowered his deputy and stole the keys, but there are whispers in town that money changed hands. Either way, Garrett's loose and asking questions about your ranch." Tommy had gone very quiet, the way he did when he sensed danger. Jake picked up his son, feeling the boy's small body trembling against his chest. All the progress they'd made, all the healing and hope, Garrett could destroy it all in one night of violence. "What kind of questions?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The kind that suggest he knows exactly where to find you." Dr. Chen's dark eyes moved between Jake and Margaret with physician's precision, reading the fear in their faces. He was seen buying ammunition and talking to men of questionable character. "I fear he plans more than simple revenge." Margaret's face had gone pale as milk, but her voice remained firm. "Then we need to be ready for him." "Ma'am, with respect, you're in no condition to fight," Dr. Chun said gently. "Perhaps it would be better if Mr. Morrison and his son moved on, drew Garrett away from here." The suggestion hit the air like a slap. Jake felt Tommy's grip tighten around his neck, and he saw Margaret's hands clench into fists at her sides. The idea of running again, of leaving this warm kitchen and safe barn, made Jake's stomach turn with sick dread. "No!" Margaret's voice cut through the morning air with surprising strength. "This is their home now. We don't abandon family when trouble comes." Family. The word hung between them like a bridge Jake was afraid to cross. In the space of a week, this pregnant widow and her small ranch had become more home than anywhere he'd lived since childhood. The thought of Tommy growing up here, of helping Margaret raise her baby, of building something lasting and good, it seemed too precious to be real. "Garrett won't come alone," Jake said quietly, his tactical mind already working on the problem. "He'll bring hired guns, maybe 6 or 8 men. We can't fight those odds with just the 3 of us." Dr. Chun straightened his shoulders with sudden resolve. "Perhaps not just the 3 of us. There are others in this territory who have suffered under Garrett's cruelty. The Chinese workers he cheated of wages, the families he's driven from their land, the women he's threatened." The doctor's usually soft voice carried steel beneath the words. "Sometimes the enemy of our enemy becomes our friend." Margaret moved closer to Jake, her presence solid and reassuring beside him. "What are you suggesting, doctor?" "I am suggesting that Bull Garrett has made many enemies over the years, and enemies can be powerful allies when properly motivated." Dr. Chun pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. I have been keeping records of his crimes, documented evidence of theft, assault, fraud. Alone, each victim is powerless. Together, we might present a united front. Jake felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope. You're talking about organizing against him. I am talking about justice, Dr. Chun corrected, and about protecting what matters most. Tommy had been listening with the intense focus children brought to conversations they sensed were important. Now he looked up at Jake with eyes too old for his 3 years. Bad man coming back? Jake's throat closed with emotion. How did you explain to a child that the world was full of people who would hurt him just for existing? How did you promise safety when you couldn't even protect yourself? Maybe, Jake said honestly, because Tommy deserved truth. But if he comes, he'll find us ready. Margaret knelt carefully beside Tommy, bringing herself to his eye level despite her awkward pregnancy. Remember what I told you about the chickens and the rooster? Tommy nodded solemnly. Sometimes one rooster thinks he can scare all the chickens by being loud and mean. But when all the chickens stick together, even the meanest rooster has to back down. It was a simple explanation, but Jake saw understanding dawn in his son's eyes. Tommy had lived through enough violence to understand that bad men existed, but he'd also experienced enough kindness here to believe that good people could fight back. We stick together? Tommy asked. We stick together, Margaret confirmed, her voice carrying the weight of a solemn promise. Dr. Chun cleared his throat softly. If we are to organize this resistance, we must move quickly. Garrett will not wait long to make his move, and we need time to gather allies and prepare defenses. Jake looked around the ranch that had become home, the neat house with its warm kitchen, the sturdy barn where Tommy played with kittens, the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Everything here represented hope, family, the chance to build something good from the wreckage of their past. Tell me what you need, Jake said, his voice steady with new determination. Over the next hour, they planned with the methodical precision of generals preparing for war. Dr. Chun would ride to the Chinese work camps and the scattered homesteads of Garrett's other victims, carrying word of the threat and the opportunity for united action. Margaret would inventory their supplies and weapons while Jake fortified the ranch's defenses. There's something else, Dr. Chun said as he prepared to leave. Mrs. Santos, whose husband died in Garrett's illegal mining operation, has connections with the Territorial Marshal's office. If we can present enough evidence of Garrett's crimes, we might be able to bring federal law into this. Hope flickered brighter in Jake's chest. Federal marshals answered to territorial governors, not local sheriffs who might be in Garrett's pocket. Real justice delivered by men who couldn't be bought or intimidated. As Dr. Chun rode away on his mission, Jake felt Margaret's hand slip into his. Her fingers were cold despite the warming day, and he could feel the slight tremor that betrayed her fear. We can do this, she said, but he heard the question underneath the words. Jake squeezed her hand gently, drawing strength from her courage even as he tried to offer his own. Yes, we can. But as he watched the dust cloud of Dr. Chen's departure fade into the distance, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to face the fight of their lives. Somewhere out there, Bull Garrett was planning his revenge, and all the hope in the world might not be enough to protect the family they'd only just begun to build. Tommy tugged at Jake's pants leg, his small face serious with concentration. Papa, when bad man comes, we fight like roosters? Jake picked up his son, holding him close against his chest. No, son, we fight like family. The crack of splintering would echo across the ranch like a gunshot as Jake's hammer missed the fence post and struck his thumb instead. He bit back a curse, sucking on the injured digit while sweat stung his eyes despite the cool October morning. 3 days had passed since Dr. Chen's warning about Bull Garrett's escape, and the waiting was driving Jake half crazy with nervous energy. Papa hurt. Tommy's worried voice came from behind him, where the boy sat on a pile of fence rails, carefully sorting nails by size like Jake had taught him. Just clumsy, Jake replied, forcing a smile as he flexed his throbbing thumb. Good thing your mama's not here to see me making such a mess of this job. But even as he joked with his son, Jake's eyes constantly scanned the horizon for dust clouds or the glint of sunlight on metal. Every bird call made him tense. Every whisper of wind through the grass could hide the sound of approaching horses. The not knowing was worse than any beating Garrett had ever given him. Margaret emerged from the house carrying a water jug and strips of cloth for bandages, her movements slower than usual as her pregnancy advanced. Dark circles under her green eyes told Jake she wasn't sleeping any better than he was. Dr. Chun should have been back by now, she said, settling carefully onto a wooden crate they dragged out to the fence line. It's been 3 days. Jake accepted the water gratefully, using the moment to study Margaret's face. Fear had drawn lines around her eyes, but underneath the worry, he saw the same stubborn determination that had made her bid on him and Tommy at the auction. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. Maybe he's having trouble convincing folks to help, Jake suggested, though privately he wondered if something worse had happened to the kind doctor. Garrett's got a way of making people too scared to stand up to him. Tommy had abandoned his nail sorting and was now building a small fort out of fence scraps, his 3-year-old mind finding play even in their preparations for war. The sight of his son's innocence in the middle of their fear made Jake's chest tight with protective fury. "Tell me about your husband," Jake said suddenly, surprising himself with the question. Margaret's hands stilled on the bandage she was rolling. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what kind of man built this place. What kind of legacy we're fighting to protect." A soft smile crossed Margaret's face, the first genuine happiness Jake had seen from her in days. Daniel was steady. Not exciting or romantic like in those dime novels, but steady as bedrock. He'd work from dawn to dusk without complaint, then sit by the fire in the evening teaching me to read account books. She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. He wanted children so badly. Used to talk about teaching sons to rope and daughters to ride, about filling this house with laughter and Christmas mornings. Her voice caught slightly. He would have loved Tommy like his own. Jake felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain exactly, but a deep recognition of loss. Sounds like a good man. The best. Margaret's eyes met his directly. But he's gone, and life keeps moving forward whether we're ready or not. This baby needs a father. Tommy needs a safe home, and I need. She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "What do you need?" Jake asked softly. Before Margaret could answer, Tommy's excited shout cut through the moment. "Riders coming. Lots of riders." Jake's blood turned to ice water as he grabbed the rifle leaning against the fence post. But as the dust cloud approached, he made out Dr. Chen's familiar figure in the lead, followed by a ragtag group of men and women on horseback and in wagons. "It's Chun," Jake called to Margaret, relief making his voice shake. And he brought help. The group that rode into their yard looked like something from a fever dream. Chinese railroad workers with their neat queues and weathered faces, Mexican families with children peeking out from wagon beds, a grizzled old mountain man who looked like he'd fought bears for breakfast. Leading them all was Dr. Chun, his usually composed face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Sinclair, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Chun called as he dismounted. "I bring allies and news, both good and troubling." A woman climbed down from one of the wagons, her black hair streaked with silver and her dark eyes blazing with determination. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "I am Maria Santos," she announced, her English accented but clear. "Bull Garrett killed my husband and stole our land. I have waited 3 years for the chance to see justice done." Behind her, an elderly black man with white whiskers and intelligent eyes stepped forward. "Pete Williams," he introduced himself. "Garrett tried to steal my homestead through false debts. I got the papers to prove it." One by one, the others introduced themselves, a catalog of Garrett's victims stretching back years. Jake felt his amazement growing as Dr. Chen's plan became clear. The Chinese doctor hadn't just gathered a few allies. He'd assembled an army of the wronged and desperate. "The good news," Dr. Chun continued, "is that we have enough documented evidence to bring federal charges against Garrett. Mrs. Santos has contacts in the Territorial Marshal's office who are very interested in our case." "And the troubling news?" Margaret asked, though Jake could see she already suspected. "Garrett knows about our gathering." He's recruited hired guns from 3 counties and is camped about 10 miles south of here. Dr. Chen's face grew grim. Our sources say he plans to attack tomorrow at dawn. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Tomorrow. After all the waiting and worrying, it would be decided in less than 24 hours. How many men does he have? Jake asked, his military instincts taking over. 12, maybe 15, Pete Williams answered. But they're professionals, gunfighters who kill for money. Jake looked around at their assembled allies, farmers, laborers, families with children. Good people, brave people, but not fighters. Not killers. We can't win a straight fight, he said quietly. Garrett's men are trained for violence. Most of our folks here. He gestured toward the families unpacking supplies from their wagons. They're not soldiers. Maria Santos stepped closer, her eyes fierce with purpose. Then we don't give him a straight fight. We give him something he doesn't expect. What do you mean? Margaret asked. Dr. Chun smiled, and for the first time since his arrival, Jake saw the calculating intelligence that had made him successful in a territory that didn't welcome Chinese physicians. We mean that Bull Garrett has spent years preying on isolated, desperate people. Tomorrow, he discovers what happens when the isolated unite. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming territory, Jake watched their unlikely army prepare for battle. Children helped their parents clean weapons while old men shared tactical knowledge gained from a dozen frontier conflicts. Margaret moved among them like a general, organizing supplies and coordinating defenses despite her pregnancy. Tommy had attached himself to Maria Santos, fascinated by her stories of ranch life in New Mexico. The boy's laughter rang across the yard as Maria taught him to braid rope, and Jake felt his throat close with emotion. Tomorrow, all of this, the laughter, the hope, the sense of belonging, could be destroyed by Garrett's greed and cruelty. Papa! Tommy appeared at Jake's elbow, his small face serious in the firelight. Are we gonna be okay? Jake knelt down, pulling his son close against his chest. He could smell the clean scent of Tommy's hair, could feel the steady beat of the boy's heart against his shoulder. Everything good in his life was contained in this small, trusting person. Yes, son, Jake said, his voice steady with conviction he didn't entirely feel. We're going to be just fine. But as he looked out into the darkness beyond their circle of firelight, Jake wondered if tomorrow would bring victory or the destruction of everything they'd built. Either way, there was no turning back now. The sound of Margaret retching in the kitchen sent ice through Jake's veins as he jolted awake in the pre-dawn darkness. This wasn't the usual morning sickness that had plagued her for weeks. This was something else. Something that made his soldier's instincts scream danger even before his mind fully processed what he was hearing. Jake pulled on his boots and hurried downstairs, leaving Tommy sleeping peacefully in the loft. He found Margaret doubled over the wash basin, her face pale as moonlight and her hands shaking as she gripped the counter for support. How long has this been going on? Jake asked, moving to steady her with gentle hands on her shoulders. Started about an hour ago, Margaret gasped between waves of nausea. Thought it was just nerves about today, but she winced as another cramp hit her. Something's wrong, Jake. The baby's not supposed to come for another 2 months. Fear unlike anything Jake had ever experienced in battle crashed over him. Margaret and her unborn child had become the center of his world, the foundation upon which he'd built every hope for the future. The thought of losing them made his hands shake worse than facing down Garrett's guns. Where's Dr. Chan? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Sleeping in the barn with the others. Margaret straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her lower back. Don't wake him yet. Could be false labor, happens sometimes with the stress. But Jake could see the fear in her green eyes, the way she held herself like something precious might break. He'd seen enough difficult births on the ranch where he'd grown up to know that babies born this early rarely survived, and mothers often didn't either. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the same dawn when Garrett planned to attack. The timing couldn't be worse if someone had planned it deliberately. I need to get you to town, Jake said. To a real doctor with proper medical supplies. Margaret shook her head firmly. There's no time and you know it. Garrett will be here within the hour. Another cramp hit her, and she doubled over with a sharp cry she tried to muffle. Jake felt torn in two directions. Every instinct screamed to protect Margaret and get her medical help. But he also knew that running now would leave their allies defenseless against Garrett's attack. The people sleeping in his barn had risked everything to help them. He couldn't abandon them. Mrs. Sinclair? Dr. Chen's voice came from the kitchen doorway. His hair mussed from sleep, but his medical bag already in his hand. I heard sounds of distress. Relief flooded through Jake as the Chinese physician moved quickly to Margaret's side. His trained hands gentle as he examined her. Dr. Chen's calm competence in the face of crisis had steadied many emergencies over the years. Early labor, Dr. Chen confirmed after a few moments. Brought on by stress and physical strain. The baby is trying to come, but we may be able to delay delivery if we act quickly. What do you need? Jake asked. Complete bed rest, quiet environment, and several herbs I don't have with me. Dr. Chen's face was grim as he calculated their options. Under normal circumstances, I would recommend immediate transport to the territorial hospital. But these are not normal circumstances. Through the kitchen window, Jake could see their allies beginning to stir as the sky lightened. Maria Santos was already up, checking weapons and organizing defensive positions. These people had come here to fight for justice, and now their leader was incapacitated at the worst possible moment. You have to go, Margaret said suddenly, reading the conflict in Jake's face. The others need you to coordinate the defense. I'm not leaving you, Jake replied fiercely. You have to. Margaret gripped his hand with surprising strength. If Garrett wins today, it won't matter whether my baby survives or not. He'll kill us all anyway. Dr. Chen looked up from preparing a medicine packet. I can manage the medical crisis, Mr. Morrison, but I cannot lead a battle. That responsibility falls to you. The weight of command settled on Jake's shoulders like a heavy coat. Outside, he could hear voices as their allies prepared for the fight of their lives. These people had trusted him with their safety, their futures, their children's lives. But inside this kitchen, Margaret was fighting her own battle, one that could claim both her life and her baby's. Mama sick. Tommy's small voice came from the stairs, where he stood in his nightshirt, clutching his wooden horse. Margaret managed a weak smile despite her pain. Mama's okay, sweetheart. Just tired. But Tommy was 3 years old, not stupid. He could see the fear in the adults' faces, could sense the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. His lower lip began to tremble. Jake picked up his son, holding him close while his mind raced through impossible choices. How did you fight a war while protecting your family? How did you lead others when your own world was falling apart? Jake! Margaret's voice cut through his spiral of panic. Look at me. He met her eyes across the kitchen, seeing past the pain to the steel underneath. This was the same woman who had stood up to an entire town to buy him and Tommy, who had faced down gossip and judgment to give them a home. We do what we have to do, she said simply. All of us. A shout from outside made them all freeze. Riders coming in fast from the south. Jake's blood turned to ice. It was too early for Garrett's planned dawn attack, which meant something had gone wrong with their intelligence. He handed Tommy to Dr. Chen and grabbed his rifle from beside the door. Keep them safe, he told the doctor. With my life, Dr. Chen replied solemnly. Jake burst through the kitchen door to find chaos erupting in the yard. Their allies were scrambling for weapons and cover as a lone rider thundered toward them through the morning mist. But as the figure drew closer, Jake recognized Pete Williams on his exhausted horse. Garrett's coming, Pete shouted as he pulled up hard, his horse lathered and blowing. Changed his plans, attacking now instead of at dawn. Got maybe 10 minutes before they hit us. Jake's mind shifted into the cold clarity of combat. 10 minutes to prepare for a battle that would decide everything: Margaret's life, Tommy's future, the safety of everyone who had trusted them with their hopes. Positions, Jake shouted, his voice carrying across the yard with military authority. Remember the plan. Let them come to us. As their allies scattered to predetermined defensive positions, Jake caught sight of Margaret watching from the kitchen window. Even pale with pain and fear, she raised one hand in a gesture of encouragement that gave him strength. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the wild yells of men riding hard for violence. In minutes, their peaceful ranch would become a battlefield, and everything they'd built together would be tested by fire and blood. Jake checked his rifle one final time and settled behind the overturned wagon that would serve as his cover. Tommy was safe with Dr. Chun and Margaret. Their allies were in position, and the morning sun was rising over the Wyoming territory like a promise of better days to come. If they survived the next hour, the first bullet shattered the kitchen window like an explosion of ice, sending glass fragments flying across the room where Dr. Chun was desperately trying to keep Margaret calm through another labor pain. Tommy screamed and buried his face against the doctor's shoulder, while Margaret bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. Outside, Jake pressed himself against the overturned wagon as Bull Garrett's voice roared across the ranch yard like thunder from hell itself. "Morrison, send out my property and maybe I'll let the others live." Jake's blood boiled at hearing Tommy called property, but he forced himself to stay focused on the tactical situation. Through a gap in the wagon boards, he could count at least 12 riders spread out in a rough semicircle around the ranch buildings. Professional gunfighters, just like Pete Williams had warned men who killed for money and felt nothing about it. "You want him? Come and take him," Jake shouted back, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. Garrett's laugh was like nails on slate. "Oh, I intend to. But first, I'm gonna burn down everything you think you own." A flaming arrow arced through the air, landing on the barn roof and immediately setting the dry shingles ablaze. Maria Santos cursed in rapid Spanish from her position behind the water trough, while the Chinese workers began a coordinated retreat toward the house, laying down covering fire as they moved. "They're trying to flush us out," Jake called to his scattered allies. "Don't take the bait." But even as he spoke, Jake knew their situation was desperate. The barn contained most of their winter hay and all of Margaret's farming equipment. If it burned completely, they'd lose everything even if they won the fight. Another volley of gunfire erupted from Garrett's men, and Jake heard a cry of pain from near the chicken coop. One of the Chinese workers, a young man named Lu who couldn't have been more than 20, stumbled backward with blood spreading across his shirt. "Cover me," Maria Santos shouted, then sprinted across the open ground toward the wounded man with bullets kicking up dirt around her feet. Jake provided covering fire, his rifle barking steadily as he tried to keep Garrett's men from getting a clear shot at the brave woman. Maria reached Lou and began dragging him toward the safety of the house, her face set with grim determination. Inside the kitchen, Dr. Chun worked frantically to slow Margaret's labor while keeping Tommy calm and treating Lou's bullet wound all at the same time. The Chinese physician's usual serene composure had cracked under the pressure, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to save 3 lives simultaneously. "The baby's coming whether we want it to or not," Dr. Chun called to Jake during a brief lull in the shooting. "I need boiling water and clean cloth. Lots of it." Jake's heart clenched with terror. Margaret giving birth in the middle of a gun battle was a nightmare beyond his worst fears. But there was no choice now except to fight harder and end this quickly. "Pete," Jake shouted to the old mountain man. "Take 3 men and circle around behind them. Use the creek bed for cover." Pete Williams nodded and began moving, his weathered face calm despite the chaos. The old fighter had survived more battles than most men ever saw, and his steady presence gave Jake hope that their desperate plan might actually work. Garrett must have noticed the flanking movement because his attacks suddenly intensified. "Burn them out," he screamed to his men. "I want that ranch turned to ash." More flaming arrows began falling like deadly rain. The barn was now fully engulfed, sending a pillar of black smoke into the morning sky. The chicken coop caught fire next, then the equipment shed. Jake watched years of Margaret's hard work disappearing in flames and felt rage build in his chest like steam in a boiler. "You want to fight, Garrett?" Jake roared, standing up behind his wagon despite the danger. "Come get one." He emptied his rifle in a sustained burst of fire that drove 2 of Garrett's men to cover, then reloaded with mechanical precision. Around the yard, Their allies were fighting with the desperate courage of people protecting their homes and families. Tommy's terrified crying from inside the house cut through the battle noise like a knife through Jake's heart. His son was experiencing the very violence Jake had tried so hard to escape, and there was nothing he could do to protect the boy from it. "Jake!" Margaret's agonized cry pierced the air, and Jake knew the baby was coming whether they were ready or not. Just then, Pete Williams' flanking attack struck home. Gunfire erupted from behind Garrett's position as the old mountain man and his companions caught the gunfighters in a crossfire. 2 of Garrett's men went down immediately, and the others began falling back in confusion. "Now!" Jake shouted to his remaining allies. "Hit them while they're confused." The tide of battle shifted as their defensive positions became launching points for a coordinated attack. Chinese workers who had built railroads through hostile territory fought with the disciplined precision of soldiers, while farming families defended their future with desperate courage. Bull Garrett himself appeared through the smoke, his massive form unmistakable as he charged toward the house on horseback, a pistol in each hand. His face was twisted with rage and madness, and Jake knew the man intended to finish this personally. "He's mine," Jake muttered, dropping his empty rifle and drawing the pistol Margaret's husband had left behind. The 2 men faced each other across the burning yard, the broken cowboy who had found a family worth fighting for, and the cruel boss who saw people as property to be owned or destroyed. Everything that had brought them to this moment hung in the air between them like smoke from the burning buildings. Garrett's first shot went wide, his horse dancing nervously in the chaos. Jake's return shot caught the animal in the shoulder, sending Garrett tumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust and fury. "End of the line, Morrison," Garrett snarled, rolling to his feet with both guns still in his hands. "You're right," Jake replied, his voice deadly calm. "It is." The silence that followed the last gunshot stretched across the ranch yard like a held breath, broken only by the crackling of flames from the burning barn and the sound of Margaret's labored breathing from inside the house. Bull Garrett lay motionless in the dirt, his reign of terror finally ended by a bullet from the pistol of the man he'd tried to destroy. Jake stood over his fallen enemy, the smoking gun still in his hand, feeling strangely empty after months of fear and anger. Around the yard, their allies were emerging from cover, checking on wounded comrades and beginning to assess the damage. The battle was over, but the cost had been higher than anyone wanted to count. "Jake!" Dr. Chen's urgent voice cut through his daze. "The baby's coming now." Reality crashed back over Jake like a cold wave. He dropped the pistol and ran toward the house, his boots skidding on the blood-stained ground. Behind him, Maria Santos was already organizing the cleanup, her natural leadership taking over as she directed men to put out fires and tend to the wounded. Inside the kitchen, Jake found chaos of a different kind. Margaret lay on a makeshift bed of quilts, her face pale and streaked with sweat as Dr. Chun worked frantically to deliver a baby that was determined to arrive 2 months early. Tommy huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror at seeing his beloved Margaret in such pain. "Is she going to be okay?" Jake asked, kneeling beside the improvised birthing bed. "The baby's breech," Dr. Chun replied tersely, his hands moving with practiced precision. "And far too early. I'm doing everything I can, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake had seen enough difficult births on ranches to know that breech babies often didn't survive, especially when they came this early. And mothers sometimes didn't either. Margaret's eyes found his through her pain, and Jake saw not fear but determination burning there. "Promise me," she gasped between contractions. "If something happens to me, you'll take care of both children. Promise me they'll have a father." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Jake said fiercely, gripping her hand. "You're the strongest person I know." But even as he spoke the words, Jake could see Dr. Chen's growing concern. The physician's usual calm confidence had given way to worried concentration as he worked to save both mother and child. "I can see the baby," Dr. Chen announced suddenly. "Mrs. Sinclair, I need you to push when I tell you, but not before." Margaret nodded, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had made her bid on Jake and Tommy at the auction. She was fighting for her child's life with every ounce of strength she possessed. Tommy crept closer, his small hand reaching out to touch Margaret's arm. "Mama, Margaret? Baby coming?" Despite her pain, Margaret managed a weak smile for the boy who had become her son in all but blood. "Yes, sweetheart. Your little brother or sister is very eager to meet you." The next few minutes passed in a blur of urgent medical activity. Dr. Chun worked with the skill that had made him respected throughout the territory, while Jake held Margaret's hand and tried to lend her his strength. Outside, they could hear their allies calling out updates on the cleanup and casualty reports. "The baby's out," Dr. Chun announced suddenly, holding up a tiny, still form that looked frighteningly fragile. Jake's heart stopped as he waited for the cry that would announce his new child's life. The seconds stretched endlessly while Dr. Chun worked over the baby, clearing airways and stimulating breathing with gentle efficiency. Then, like a miracle, a thin wail filled the kitchen air. "She's alive," Dr. Chun said, his voice full of wonder and relief. Small but breathing on her own. A fighter, like her mother. Margaret collapsed back against the quilts, tears of exhaustion and joy streaming down her face. "A daughter," she whispered. "Daniel always wanted a daughter." Jake felt his own eyes burn with tears as Dr. Chun placed the tiny baby in Margaret's arms. The child was smaller than any newborn he'd ever seen, her skin translucent and delicate, but her eyes were open and alert as she looked up at her mother. "She's beautiful," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Tommy had crept closer, his terror forgotten in the wonder of meeting his new sister. "Baby little," he observed with 3-year-old directness. "Very little," Margaret agreed, adjusting the blanket around her daughter. "She'll need Big Brother to help take care of her." The implications of Margaret's words hit Jake like a physical blow. She was including him in this family moment, accepting him not as hired help or temporary protection, but as a father to both children. The trust and love in her gesture made his chest tight with overwhelming emotion. "What should we name her?" Margaret asked, looking up at Jake with eyes that held their entire future. Jake thought about everything they'd been through together, the auction where he'd been sold like livestock, the weeks of healing and building trust, the battle they just survived. This baby represented hope born from desperation, love growing from the ashes of loss. "Hope," he said finally. "Her name should be Hope." Outside, the sound of approaching horses made everyone tense until they recognized Pete Williams' voice calling out in greeting. "Federal marshals coming in. We got official law here now." Through the window, Jake could see uniformed men riding into the yard, their badges gleaming in the morning sunlight. Real justice, delivered by officers who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Bull Garrett's surviving men were already in chains, their weapons confiscated and their reign of terror finally ended. Maria Santos appeared in the kitchen doorway, her clothes singed and her face dirty but her eyes bright with victory. "It's over," she announced simply. "Garrett's dead, his men are captured, and the federal marshals have enough evidence to shut down his whole operation." Dr. Chun looked up from checking baby Hope's vital signs. "And this little one is going to be just fine with proper care and lots of love." As Jake looked around the kitchen, at Margaret holding their daughter, at Tommy chattering excitedly about his new sister, at the friends who had risked everything to help them, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete happiness. The ranch buildings could be rebuilt, the cattle could be regathered, and the scars of battle would heal. But the family they'd created together was stronger than any external threat. They'd found something worth fighting for, and they'd won the right to keep it. "Welcome home, Hope," Jake whispered to his tiny daughter, and knew that this time, it truly was forever. The wedding dress hanging in Margaret's bedroom had belonged to her grandmother, its yellowed lace and tiny pearl buttons telling stories of love that had lasted through harder times than most people could imagine. But as Margaret stood before the cracked mirror 3 weeks after Hope's dramatic birth, she wondered if marrying Jake Morrison was the right choice or just the practical one. "You look beautiful, Mama Margaret," Tommy said from where he sat on the bed, carefully holding his sleeping baby sister while Margaret wrestled with the dress's complicated fastenings. At 3 years old, He'd appointed himself Hope's official protector, following Margaret around the house like a devoted shadow whenever the baby was in her arms. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret replied, though her reflection showed a woman who looked more tired than beautiful. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights with a premature baby, while the loose fit of the dress reminded her that her body was still recovering from Hope's difficult birth. Dr. Chun had warned her that babies born so early faced challenges that could last months or even years. Hope was gaining weight slowly, but she still seemed frighteningly fragile compared to the robust infants Margaret had helped deliver on neighboring ranches. Every breath the baby took felt like a small miracle that might not be repeated. A soft knock on the bedroom door interrupted her worries. "Margaret? You ready?" Jake's voice carried through the wood, formal and careful in a way that made her stomach clench with uncertainty. "Almost," she called back, her fingers fumbling with the last button. "Give me another minute." But the truth was, Margaret needed more than a minute to sort through the tangle of emotions that had led to this moment. 3 weeks ago, Jake had proposed while she was still weak from childbirth, his words practical rather than romantic. "Hope needs a father's name, and Tommy needs legal protection. Marrying me makes sense for everyone." Sense. Not love, not passion, not even affection, just cold, logical sense. Margaret understood the reasoning behind Jake's proposal, but part of her heart ached for something more. Her first marriage to Daniel had been built on friendship that grew into deep love over time. This arrangement felt more like a business contract written in the shadow of recent trauma. "Mama, Margaret sad?" Tommy asked, his young face scrunched with concern as he noticed her expression in the mirror. Margaret forced a smile, not wanting to burden the child with adult worries. "Not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking about big changes." "Papa Jake good," Tommy said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "He fixes things and reads stories and doesn't yell even when I spill milk out of the mouths of babes." Margaret looked at her reflection again, seeing past the tired woman to someone who had survived the unthinkable and come out stronger. Maybe love could grow from respect and shared responsibility. Maybe she was asking for too much in expecting romance from a man who had been beaten down by life until he'd almost forgotten how to hope. Through the window, she could see their wedding guests gathering in the yard, the same people who had fought beside them against Bull Garrett, now dressed in their Sunday best and carrying wildflowers picked from the prairie. Maria Santos was directing the setup with military precision, while Pete Williams tuned his fiddle for the dancing that would follow the ceremony. Dr. Chun had agreed to perform the service, his status as an educated man giving him the legal authority to marry them under territorial law. The Chinese physician had become more than a doctor to their makeshift family. He was friend, advisor, and the closest thing to a father figure that Margaret had known since her own parents died. Hope stirred in Tommy's arms, her tiny fist waving in the air as she made the soft mewing sounds that meant she was hungry. Margaret automatically reached for her daughter, the maternal instinct that had surprised her with its fierce intensity taking over all other concerns. "Time for little miss to eat," Margaret murmured, settling into the rocking chair Jake had built during the long nights when Hope's crying kept everyone awake. The baby latched on immediately, her survival instinct as strong as her fragile appearance suggested. Another knock, this one softer and accompanied by Maria Santos' voice. "Margaret, the guests are ready when you are. Come in, Maria." The older woman entered with the quiet competence that had made her a natural leader during their recent crisis. Her own wedding dress, borrowed for the occasion, fit Margaret better than her grandmother's gown, and Maria's experienced hands made quick work of the adjustments. "Having second thoughts?" Maria asked gently, her dark eyes reading Margaret's face with uncomfortable accuracy. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been married twice herself." Maria's smile carried wisdom earned through hard experience. "My first husband I married for love, my second for security. Both marriages had their challenges, but love can grow from many different seeds." Margaret shifted Hope to her shoulder, patting the baby's back while she considered Maria's words. "Jake proposed out of duty, not affection. How do I build a marriage on that foundation?" "The same way you build anything lasting," Maria replied, straightening the lace collar of Margaret's dress. one day at a time, with patience and honesty and the willingness to see the good in each other. Through the window, they could see Jake pacing nervously near the improvised altar Dr. Chun had set up under the old oak tree. He'd borrowed a suit from Pete Williams that was too big in the shoulders and too short in the arms, making him look like a boy playing dress-up. But there was something endearing about his obvious nerves, something that reminded Margaret that he was taking this step as much on faith as she was. "He loves Tommy more than his own life," Margaret said quietly, watching Jake kneel down to adjust something on Tommy's miniature suit. "And he's been so gentle with Hope, like he's afraid she might break if he breathes too hard." "Men show love through protection and provision," Maria observed. "Jake Morrison has given you both, even when it meant risking his own safety. That's not duty, Margaret. That's devotion." Hope had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder, her tiny features peaceful in a way that made Margaret's heart ache with protective love. This baby represented everything good that had come from the worst period of her life. Hope born from desperation, family forged from necessity, strength discovered in vulnerability. "I think I'm ready," Margaret said finally, standing and smoothing down her skirts. Maria smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Then let's go make you a wife again." As they walked toward the door, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror one last time. The woman looking back at her was different from the desperate widow who had bid on a broken cowboy and his son at a public auction. This woman had fought for her family, survived childbirth during a gun battle, and was now choosing to build something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. The sound of fiddle music drifted through the open window, mixing with the laughter of children and the soft conversations of people who had become more than neighbors. They were the chosen family that had emerged from shared struggle and mutual support. "Come on, Mama Margaret," Tommy called from the yard, his voice bright with excitement. "Papa Jake's waiting." Margaret took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out to meet her future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage that had brought her this far. And maybe, just maybe, she would find that love could indeed grow from the most unlikely beginnings. The sound of Hope's first laugh rang across the ranch yard like church bells on Christmas morning, stopping everyone in their tracks as they watched the 6-month-old baby giggle at Tommy's silly faces. Margaret paused in hanging laundry on the line, her hands stilling on the wet sheets as she marveled at how much their lives had changed since that terrifying day when Hope decided to arrive during a gun battle. Spring had come early to the Wyoming territory in 1882, melting the snow into rushing creeks that fed the greening pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully. The ranch buildings, rebuilt after Bull Garrett's attack, stood sturdy and proud against the backdrop of mountains that stretched toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Jake emerged from the barn where he'd been working on a new plow, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his face bearing the healthy tan of a man who spent his days working land he could finally call home. At 28, he looked younger than he had during those desperate months when he and Tommy had been running from Garrett's vengeance. Security and love had erased the hard lines from around his eyes. "Did she just laugh?" Jake asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached the blanket where Hope lay kicking her chubby legs in the warm sunshine. "First time," Margaret confirmed, her voice soft with wonder. Tommy was making faces at her, and she just giggled. Tommy, now 4 years old and bursting with the confidence that came from being thoroughly loved, immediately resumed his performance for his baby sister. His dark hair had grown longer over the winter, and Margaret had taken to braiding it back like the other ranch children. The transformation from the silent, terrified boy of a year ago to this chattering, confident child never failed to amaze her. "Look, Papa Jake. She likes it when I do this." Tommy demonstrated his latest silly expression, crossing his eyes and sticking out his tongue. Hope responded with another peal of delighted laughter, her tiny hands reaching toward her big brother with grabbing motions that made everyone smile. Dr. Chun had pronounced her completely healthy at her last examination, though still small for her age. The premature birth that had terrified them all now seemed like just another part of Hope's determined personality. Jake knelt on the blanket beside his children, both legally his now, since the adoption papers had been finalized through the territorial court. Think she's going to be a troublemaker like her brother? Hey, Tommy protested, though his grin showed he took it as a compliment. I'm not trouble. I'm helpful. Margaret caught Jake's eye over the children's heads, sharing the moment of parental amusement that had become common between them. Their marriage, which had started as a practical arrangement, had grown into something deeper and more complex over the months. Not the passionate romance of dime novels, but something steadier and more enduring. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and growing affection. Speaking of helpful, Margaret said, settling onto the blanket with them, Mrs. Chun sent word that she'd like Tommy to start coming to her reading lessons twice a week. She thinks he's ready for more advanced instruction. Jake's face lit up with pride. Dr. Chen's wife had established an informal school for the territory's children, teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic in her home near town. The opportunity for Tommy to receive proper education was something Jake had never dared to hope for during their desperate months on the run. Can I really go to school like the other kids? Tommy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Really? Margaret confirmed. You'll ride with Pedro Santos on Tuesdays and Fridays, and Mrs. Chun will teach you all sorts of wonderful things. Tommy launched himself at Jake in an enthusiastic hug that nearly knocked the grown man over. Thank you, Papa Jake. Thank you, Mama Margaret. The easy use of both parental titles made Margaret's chest warm with contentment. Tommy had taken to calling her Mama Margaret shortly after Hope's birth, while Jake had become Papa Jake to distinguish him from the father Tommy barely remembered. The boy had created his own family structure that acknowledged both loss and new beginnings. Hope, not to be left out of the excitement, began making the cooing sounds that meant she wanted attention. Jake picked her up carefully, still amazed by how tiny she seemed in his large hands. The baby had grown attached to him over the months, often falling asleep against his chest while he read aloud in the evenings. What about you, little miss? Jake asked Hope in the gentle voice he reserved for children and wounded animals. You going to be a scholar like your big brother? Hope responded by grabbing a handful of his hair and trying to put it in her mouth, making everyone laugh. At 6 months old, she was just beginning to sit up on her own, and everything she could reach went directly to her mouth for investigation. Margaret watched her husband, and he truly was her husband now, in every way that mattered, interact with their children, and felt a contentment she'd never experienced even in her first marriage. With Daniel, she'd been happy but always aware that something was missing. With Jake, she felt complete in a way she hadn't known was possible. I got news from town yesterday, Jake said, settling Hope more securely in his lap. The territorial governor officially pardoned me for taking those cattle from Garrett. Said any man fighting to protect his child from slavery deserved recognition, not punishment. Margaret's breath caught with surprise and relief. Though Jake's actions had been morally justified, the legal shadow of cattle theft had hung over their family since the beginning. The official pardon meant he could travel freely, find work anywhere, even run for public office if he chose. That's wonderful, Margaret said, reaching over to squeeze his free hand. You're completely free now. I've been free since the day you bid on us, Jake replied, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter. Everything else is just paperwork. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken acknowledgement of how far they'd traveled from that awful auction platform to this peaceful family scene. Tommy had wandered off to chase a butterfly, while Hope dozed contentedly in Jake's arms, her small fingers curled around one of his thumbs. I love you, Margaret said suddenly, the words surprising her even as they left her lips. Jake's eyes widened, then softened with emotion that made her breath catch. I love you too, he replied, his voice rough with feeling. Been wanting to say it for months, but didn't know if you wanted to hear it. I want to hear it, Margaret whispered, leaning closer to him across the space between them on the blanket. I want to hear it every day for the rest of our lives. Jake shifted Hope to one arm and reached out to cup Margaret's cheek with his free hand. Then I'll make sure you do. Their kiss was soft and full of promise, interrupted only when Hope decided to grab a handful of Margaret's hair and Tommy came running back with breathless news about the butterfly he'd been chasing. As the afternoon sun painted golden light across the ranch that had become their sanctuary, Margaret looked around at everything they'd built together and felt the deep satisfaction of dreams fulfilled. The Wyoming territory was still hard country, but it was their country now, and that made all the difference. They'd found something rarer than gold in these wide open spaces, a place where broken things could heal, where forgotten people could become family, and where love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. And as Hope's laughter rang out across the prairie once again, Margaret knew their story was just beginning.